Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carol Soon, Senior Research Fellow and Head of Society and Culture at the Institute of Policy Studies. Welcome to the second installment of IPS Online. IPS Online is a regular virtual series that discusses issues relating to Singapore's governance, economy, society, and culture. This forum is being live streamed on Facebook. It will also be recorded and uploaded on the IPS website and Facebook page later. Please submit your questions at any time through our Facebook page. We will try our best to answer them. Now, the forum will last an hour, but depending on how the discussion goes, it may go on for a little bit longer, and we hope that you'll be able to stay with us. Today's topic is private data, public good. Now, by gathering location data and other personal information, digital surveillance has helped countries like China and South Korea manage the spread of COVID-19. Some countries are already starting to use phones to record data, including names, addresses, gender, age, location, and COVID-19 test results. Users of Australia's COVID Safe app monitored closely after Singapore's Trace Together app will be contacted by health officials if an app user they have come into close contact with tests positive for COVID-19. In Egypt, a recently launched app uses a phone's location services to alert users if they have been near anyone with COVID-19. Now, there are more countries, including UK and the US, which are in different stages of rolling out contact tracing apps as they contemplate loosening restrictions and reopening the economy. In India, the Arogya Setu app is nearly mandatory. The app continuously collects data through Bluetooth and GPS and cross-references the data with the central government database to determine if the user has come into contact with an infected person. In March, the Singapore government launched Trace Together, but only about 25% of the population have downloaded the app. Now, this adoption level is way below the 75%, which is required for the app to be effective. To date, there has been much debate on the use of such apps in countries that are rolling out similar initiatives. On one end, people from different sectors have raised concerns pertaining to privacy intrusion, security threats, and opening the door to government surveillance or more government surveillance. On the other end, we have some calling for the use of digital contact tracing apps to be made mandatory. While the focus has been on the use of personal data during a pandemic, the use of personal data for public good has broad and long-term implications beyond COVID-19. Through today's forum, we hope to identify policy issues and proffer possible solutions as we navigate what is clearly a complicated and difficult issue. Now, before this session, we had invited you to take part in an informal poll on the topic. Let us take a look at some of your responses. Can we have the first slide, please? Now, this slide shows the top statements which saw greater agreement among the poll respondents. The majority thinks that privacy is not more important than contact tracing. The government may use personal data for the purposes they declare, and the government must accept liability for personal theft and abuse. Next slide, please. And here are the statements that saw greater disagreement. People feel differently about if they are being tracked when they're using the app, who should be responsible for the safety of data, and they feel differently about opting out from giving personal data to the government. And now I would like to introduce our panelists who will take this debate further. Our first panelist is Associate Professor Sonn Jun Wong. Dr. Sonn is from the Bartlett School of Planning, Faculty of the Built Environment at the University College London. He is joined by Ms. Teo Yi-Ling, Senior Fellow from the Centre of Excellence for National Security at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. The third panelist is my colleague, Mr. Christopher Gee, Senior Research Fellow and Head of Governance and Economy at the Institute of Policy Studies. I would first invite each panelist to share his and her thoughts about the topic. Now, Dr. Sonn, thank you so much for joining us in Singapore. South Korea has been regarded as a model for the use of electronic surveillance, which has enabled it to avoid severe lockdowns during the pandemic. About 3 months after the outbreak has started in the country, only a handful of new cases are being reported daily, and 258 fatalities have been recorded in total. Can you share with us the latest developments in South Korea pertaining to the use of citizens' data in combating COVID-19? And also, what are some of the concerns surrounding what some would say is overexposure of people's personal information?
Right. First of all, thank you, Carol, for inviting me for this wonderful opportunity to share my views with people in Singapore. As you are saying, South Korea has been doing very well in controlling COVID-19, and in the process, three types of surveillance technology have been used to trace patients. It was mobile phone location data, credit card transaction data, and the transportation card data. Apps are used only to check the location of a confirmed patient and the self-quarantining people, not to find the new patients. So it was mainly mobile phone, credit card, and the transportation card data that was used to find the contacts of people, to find the people who have contacted with confirmed patients. And it has been successful, as Carol has been saying, and so no lockdown, and the dance clubs, movie theaters, all open, not to mention factories and offices. And there has been there was scheduled opening of schools and universities in the next month. But that was until last week. And something happened on 6th of May. There was a patient was found. He was just one of the patients. I mean, we had patients, a few patients every day, but it turned out that this particular patient visited 5 dance clubs in Itaewon in one evening. So these five clubs became the hotspots of infections. So Seoul Metropolitan Government declared the entire area of Itaewon, where 5 dance clubs are located, as the dangerous area. And the main problem, and so one of the main problem is that there are lots of dance clubs and the bars there, where infection is very easy. But another problem is that it's an area where LGBTQ community gathers. So because with the high concentration of LGBTQ, and obviously they are likely to be reluctant to come out for testing, because many of them are still in the closet, and so government is doing 2 things to deal with this situation. On the one hand, they got the list of more than 2,000 people who are in Itaewon area on that day, and on the day of infection. So they have the list. I mean, the list is from the mobile phone location data, because as you all know, mobile phones are connected to mobile towers. So by getting a record of connections between mobile phones and the mobile tower, the mobile phone companies always have a record of location of mobile phones. So the Seoul Metropolitan Government got that data. So they have a full list of people who are in the area on the day. And so on the other hand, Seoul Metropolitan Government is promising complete anonymity of testing, and at the same time threatening fine of $2,000. And LGBTQ communities is collaborating, especially the celebrities like singers and the comedian, 2 biggest celebrities of the community, is appealing for the community to get tested. It is probably the biggest crisis since 2 months ago, when there was a big outbreak in Shincheonji Christian church. So some Koreans are afraid that what happened to foreign workers in Singapore can happen to LGBTQ community in South Korea. But there is difference. I mean, foreign workers in Singapore work and sleep together, but LGBTQ community in South Korea go to clubs a lot, but they don't necessarily live together. So that's the latest news.
Thank you, Dr. Sonn.
Right.
Now, South Korea's strategy includes the use of phone alerts, but not the Bluetooth apps being developed elsewhere. Like what Dr. Sonn has mentioned, it is based on a degree of surveillance that people in many other countries may not accept. Now, in Singapore, surveillance by the state is not new. We have island-wide CCTV cameras, and there are plans to fit lampposts with sensors and cameras to collect a wide range of data. So what would you say are the key barriers to people's adoption of the contact tracing app in Singapore? And how should users' concerns be addressed effectively?
Thank you, Carol. And like Dr. Sonn, I'd like to kind of record my thanks to IPS for inviting me to be part of this panel. These are strange times indeed, and of course, it's not just us in Singapore, like you were saying, but there are many countries around the world grappling with this issue about tracing and using data. So I'm aware of these following concerns: loss of privacy, data security. Given the instances of cyber attacks on government databases, the most notable being the SingHealth one, and concerns about functionality like turning on Bluetooth, which is how the app works. It just eats up your phone battery. I've also heard people say that because, since we're all not really out and about because it's circuit breaker and being told to stay at home, there's no point using the app. So when people assert that they have privacy concerns, I'm thinking it could be fears about what they imagine the app may access on the individual's phone and what data could be collected about the individual's location. And, maybe what that might disclose about the person's movements, where they've been, and in what location and time, day, and all that. Now, this mindset persists, despite the very clear outlining of how these data privacy concerns are addressed on the Trace Together website. It's very clear. It's very clear there. Maybe people just feel that this privacy is such a an amorphous and uncertain thing. Maybe in the Singapore context, because we don't have a constitutional right of privacy, and so they're not sure what it means and how far it extends, what my rights are. So I try and sort of like maybe shut down a conversation by saying, I'm concerned about privacy, so therefore, end of story. So another aspect might be this, like you mentioned, there's the existence of CCTV cameras everywhere. People know this. The thing is, they're placed far enough away, so psychologically, any awareness of them is peripheral. Whereas your smartphone is very much in close proximity with you. And that may well hit closer to the bone in terms of feeling that your movements are being traced, that you're being surveilled. Then the concern about data security. It may be the thought that I don't want to let the authorities have this data about me because I don't know if it will be safe. Unsurprising, given the spate of cyber attacks on government databases, in some instances, resulting in the data being compromised. And so at the heart of this is a trust issue. So then you have the concern about functionality, and this is, essentially a very pragmatic sort of reaction. Now, this is a valid one. The use of any app shouldn't compromise the overall functionality of the host device, which would then affect the functionality of the app. Now, the use mustn't be onerous or difficult, because that's a market fail right there, I think. All right, then the final concern about, no point using the app since people are moving around less. Well, this may be valid during circuit breaker and getting people to stay at home, but as we gradually open up society and the economy, now this may be less relevant as Trace Together could be in usage for the foreseeable future, and as Dr. Sonn just pointed out, there are a number of instances around the world, South Korea being example, where countries are opening up, or in that case, South Korea never really completely shut down, and infection numbers are picking up again. So this is actually for the medium term that the government is hoping that we can use Trace Together. So my thought is that you will have this range of responses because people are being persuaded by the government, persuaded, nudged, cajoled, please help us, into stepping up to help with a national security matter and the matter of public health. Now, more often than not, we are told to do something as an imperative. This is clarity. Do this. So then we go and do it. Now, but in this instance, we are being asked to please help the government. It's not mandatory for you to do this. We need your consent. And maybe people are confused and not knowing how to respond. Maybe they may be thinking, if I sign up for the app, if I install it, if I download it, what about all the concerns I outlined earlier? Is there privacy? Is my data secure? I can't keep recharging my phone, all the time. It's not convenient. And look, the government is empowered under the Infectious Diseases Act to require, something like this, that you do this because we need the information to keep the community at large secure. But it's refraining from exercising that executive muscle. It almost seems to be like a negotiation almost between the state and the individual, with one side of the bargaining sort of unsure of the intentions of the other. So, I was thinking about your question, and I'm like, are we witnessing a modification of the social contract between citizen and state? So Trace Together is different from One Service, otherwise known as the Baotou app. People are enthusiastic about using One Service to report circuit breaker violations. This is a one-way street. I report what I think is circuit breaker violating, and the government takes care of it. So you have the satisfaction that you have done your duty as a concerned citizen. Now, Trace Together requires something very different. It's a two-way communication that we may or may not want to have. Maybe we don't want to know bad news. It depends on your psychological makeup. Maybe we can't see beyond perceived inconvenience, or see beyond the fact that ignorance of exposure could lead to wider infections. Now, there is also then there's also the phenomenon of optimism bias. We think it won't happen to us. We won't be infected, only to others. There's a whole other debate about othering, which is, maybe this is not the forum for it. So people may be left wondering, okay, so government says it's not mandatory. I have a choice. But if I don't sign up for this, will they know I didn't sign up? What if they find out? Is there a way for them to find out? And is there going to be a consequence? Frankly, the only consequence I see is that a person who does not have the app will be denied entry to many places. So you exercise freedom of choice, but then as a consequence, your freedom of movement is restricted. So the app, as I see it, this is very, very much in beta. It hasn't even been stress tested, because we just don't have the numbers, the sign-up numbers to do it. I was just reading on the, I think MIT review. Iceland is using an app which is sort of based on our platform on Trace Together. They have only a 40% take-up rate, and their authorities are saying, no great shakes. This not a silver bullet. You still have to do manual tracing, but Trace Together was never marketed or promoted as a silver bullet. This is the only thing we need, because it actually it supplements manual tracing. So I think that's all I have to say at this point.
Thank you, Yi-Ling. That was a very, very comprehensive response. You talk about the different types of concerns that people have, ranging from issues they are experiencing with the functionality, as well as certain possible cognitive biases, and certainly privacy fears. And we are already seeing certain questions in the Facebook comments, very pointed questions with regards to privacy, government consultation, etc., which we will come back to. Now, Chris, over to you. Now, the pandemic has brought to the fore, again, the very age-old tension and debate between the personal and the public. So beyond COVID-19, what applications and benefits does the sharing of personal data hold for society at large? And how do you think we should define this public good?
Okay, thanks, and hi everyone. I'm very glad, like Dr. Sonn and Yi-Ling, to have this opportunity to speak about this issue of private data and the public good, which I think is it presents some very stark choices for our society, both in the near term as we adapt to life with COVID-19, but even more importantly, our long-term success as a united progressive society. So Carol, I'll answer your second question first, and then hopefully cover your first question as we go through. I'll make the case, the argument that in the world that we will live in the future, one where we'll have to contend with possible global threats like recurrent pandemics or climate emergencies, our notions of private or confidential data will need to become more adaptable and more capable of being shared depending on the context to serve the broader interests of the community, and therefore indirectly also benefiting the individual sharing his or her private data. Today in Singapore, we live in a dense urban setting, a global city-state that has thrived on the networks that have their hubs centered in Singapore. This physical proximity, this co-location, the agglomeration in this city have increased the economic and social dynamism of the place. And Singapore today is a highly developed, sophisticated society, an economy with one of the highest GDP per capita rates in the world. But this population density also brings with it downsides, what economists call negative externalities, such as congestion, environmental degradation, and the greater risk of disease spread. It is in this immediate crisis, a life-threatening situation like what we have at the present, that I think most Singaporeans, like the South Koreans, implicitly understand the idea that personal liberties and rights would have to be subordinated in the public interest. That is why I think, just as we have accepted, perhaps a little reluctantly, greater restrictions on our personal liberties, such as having to wear face masks in public, will also ultimately embrace the use of apps like Trace Together and Safe Entry, once the technical issues that Yi-Ling talked about are all worked out, and particularly if we are mandated to use them by law. However, as we get beyond this immediate crisis, if we want to live in a society that is well equipped to cope with not just the medical and environmental emergencies that come our way, but to thrive in non-crisis periods, we'll need to consider the ways in which we deal with our private data in the long term. And we can go two ways with this. The obvious and natural response would be to withdraw into our shells, hunkering down and raising the barriers around all our private data. This would be akin to the psychological, the behavioral responses that trigger the hoarding of food, face masks, or even toilet paper. But this time, it's the hoarding of intangible assets, namely our private data. Going down this path is a reaction born of fear and mistrust that our private data will be stolen, misused by bad actors, even including governments present and in the future. This manifests in a withdrawal from the online and digital space by everybody, and might also be accompanied by very costly data security arms races, the costs of which are ultimately borne by all of us. This seems to me to be most resembling the unsatisfactory situation that we have at the moment. The other way is not instinctive, but one that I believe that today's society, living in a modern data-driven world, will need to go towards. This path requires individuals that make up that society to support the principle that some private data can and should be considered a public good, just like highways, nature reserves, libraries, or HDB void decks. By pooling and aggregating data from both private and public sources, cities can more effectively plan infrastructure, allocate resources to overcome the negative externalities that I talked about earlier. This is the smart city, smart nation concept, and allows for improved amenities through the use of data at all levels, from the highest to the micro individual level. We can already see examples of this sharing of private data benefiting the public at large, and individuals who contribute their personal data. They all gain from improved services as a result. Congestion monitoring apps like Waze collect personal location and travel data from commuters and aggregate this data to provide real-time journey planning information. Other examples exist in the health domain. Electronic health records contain a trove of personal data, almost all of which might be considered highly confidential and is heavily protected as a result. But if this data was anonymized and aggregated in such a way so as to ensure that no personally identifiable information remains, then it might be utilized in ways that benefit both individuals and society at large. And we can go even further and consider contextual digital handshaking systems that help us navigate our lives in a post-COVID world where there's a civic responsibility on the part of citizens to share some of their personal but non-confidential data for the public good. And perhaps we can discuss what some of these applications might be a little bit more later on. May I just end by reading out two verses from the English essayist John Donne, his famous poem from 1624, which many of you will know. He says, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind. And therefore, never send it to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." In the context of the public sharing of private data, I would interpret John Donne's words like this: every piece of myself I contribute to the whole enlarges my society because I am part of it. Every bit of data shared connects us all together and enriches everyone, making us greater than the sum of our individual parts. Thank you, and I'm eagerly anticipating the discussion that we're going to have all of this with all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Yi-Ling and Dr. Sonn. I think all three of you covered very, very important points pertaining to this topic about personal data for public good. So we will start the discussion. And one thing that kind of, I think is a common theme across all three of your opening remarks is the issue of privacy, right? Yi-Ling, earlier you mentioned in Singapore, we don't have a system or clear explanation of constitutional right of privacy. And we look at some of the questions that have come in. If you allow me to check the questions that have come in on Facebook comments, we have Mr. Dewey Sim, who asked precisely about the issue of privacy protection. So, for example, his question is, what can the government do to assure people that their data would not be used unnecessarily and will not be tapped on outside of pandemic reasons? So essentially, we are talking about thinking about what we can do to overcome some of the privacy concerns about the sharing of personal data. Perhaps, Yi-Ling, can we have some brief remarks from you about this? And then I want to, and we'll see if the other two panelists have anything to contribute.
I'm thinking about what, thanks, Carol. I'm thinking about for what Christopher just said about the sharing. And I'm also thinking about what I said about trust. And I think we're at a watershed time now where we're having to look at the whole issue of persons as sources of data that feeds this digital present and future that that is envisaged for us. So I think at a very, very base level, it's holding a government accountable. It's also expanding and broadening a conversation. And I alluded to the social contract earlier on. Are we looking at a modification? Do we have to sort of rethink or think differently in terms of what it means to be a part of society, a digital society? Here's the conundrum for me. We are happy to give our data to private corporations for whatever they promise us. But then we are a little bit unsure about how to deal with the government taking our data. I remember when we were discussing this, a couple of days ago, vis-a-vis a corporation or an online platform, there is a transaction. I let you have my data, I get something back in return. Whether that thing is useful to me or not, that's a separate sort of like a conversation. But in terms of the government wanting to use my data, I'm not sure what I get back in return. And maybe that's not clear yet, or maybe that is something that government has to assure and be transparent about in terms of how they're going to use the data, how they secure it, and what measures they're going to take to secure it, and how they will use it, in what context. So it's very much a fact and circumstance kind of a context here, and it's kind of difficult to say, where the line is drawn sometimes, because it's all context based. We have the Personal Data Protection Act that is not applicable to the government. That only kind of provides for data protection in terms of individuals and business organizations. So therein, and then you have other provisions, in existing laws like the Criminal Procedure Code, the Cybersecurity and Computer Misuse Act. Government can access data of individuals from your telcos, from the platforms. They can request for it if it's for public good purposes, national security purposes. So I mean, that's my immediate response to that question.
Thank you, Yi-Ling. So essentially, I think one key point that I take from what you just said is about transparency. So government have to be clear about what data is being collected and used for what purposes. And I think in the comment section, Dr. Gillian Koh from IPS, her comment was, we needing a clearer social compact. The government can collect the data, but it should specify the conditions when the data will be used, whom it will be released to, and how other users will be prevented. Chris and Dr. Sonn, what are your thoughts on how else might we address some of these privacy concerns? Clearly, I think there have been some commentaries published on the topic, as well as comments that were submitted by some of the viewers who participated in our informal poll, essentially alluding to the possibility of going on a slippery slope, right? So now we give our data, we through safe entry and trace together. In future, who knows how and our data will be used and what more would be taken from us. So how would you address some of these concerns? Chris, may I start with you? And then after that, I would like Dr. Sonn perhaps draw on his experience and his analysis of, say, the South Korean case, and how did the government address some of those issues?
Okay, you talked about this slippery slope idea, Carol, and I think we're already partway down that slippery slope into that big brother scenario that we're all worried about. I think Yi-Ling talked about this very asymmetric, transactional-based approach that we have with the use of all digital services at the moment, where the big tech companies, the government is essentially dictating to citizens the things that we need to do with multi-page long privacy terms and the conditions before we can access the services that have been provided to us. But I think there is another way we can do this, and this is for citizens to take control over their attitude, their relationship to their own personal data. Instead of being balkanized into our individual silos, we can collectively establish what might be considered to be digital citizen charters. Right? So, governments like Canada, New Zealand have put out these digital charters, but this is not that. What I'm thinking of is more personalized but self-organized digital citizen charters, which spell out our individual appetites for data sharing very clearly, allowing those who seek access to that data to convince each one of us the merits and benefits of giving the keys to our personal data. right? So, craft these digital citizen charters that essentially spell out our relationship with our data and what people will need to do to allow us to give them access to that data.
Dr. Sonn?
Yes, so I agree with the other two speakers said, especially what Yi-Ling said about the specific conditions that the government is allowed to use, get access to the data. I think that's very important. I think we have we need a positive list to clarify in what situation the government can access to what type of data. So in the current situation in South Korea is, currently Center for Disease Control of South Korea is getting access to mobile phone data and credit card data because of a specific law that was revised a few years ago after in the aftermath of MERS in 2015. So that law for prevention and the control of infectious disease, this revised version of it specifies what kind of, alongside with all the other things, it has the list of things that Center for Disease Control can do, and that they get access to certain type of data through police, and for each individual, the police have to approve the access of the data. So there's that. So the process is relatively transparent, so which is good. But it turned out that that law wasn't perfect. There are a few serious glitches and small but serious problems, like the incident that I mentioned earlier. That this one of the people who visited dance clubs in Itaewon visited gay club. Right, so that's a sign that this person might be one of the members of the LGBTQ community, which he may or may not want to reveal. So the name isn't known, but the information, the mobility information, is specific enough to identify that person for people who already know this person. So not the general public, but people around him would see. Would know that this person has visited a gay bar, right? So that's so the problem was that that the law doesn't say that the Center for Disease Control could reveal that information. So I think after the positive list of things that the government can do, there must be a negative list as well. Within each of the positive list, you have to provide what the government shouldn't do. So in the current situation, South Koreans understand that this is the first time that we do this, and we see the imperfections in the law, but Koreans are kind of understanding mood, but we see the problems there as well.
If I may follow on this, because we have a question from Mr. Keegan Lee. His question is, did the South Korean government consult the public before rolling out digital surveillance tools? And what were the public's responses to some of these efforts?
The law was passed in the National Assembly. So the data, the Center for Center for CDC gets the access to the data based on the law. So there was no public consultation necessary before they get the disease, before they get access to the data. The only requirement was that the Minister of Health and Welfare have to declare that this is a pandemic situation. But before that happened, the Koreans already saw what happened in China. So people are quite understanding that it was a necessary actions the government should take. I mean, when the law was passed, it didn't make big news. I mean, people didn't pay that much attention to this new law in 2016. But so the law already empowered the government to get access, and this when the time has come for the government to use the law, people already saw what happened in China. So they didn't oppose the enforcement of the law.
Mm. Now, Chris earlier talked about the long-term important implications about people sharing their personal data for the larger good of the society, right? And he highlighted two possible trajectories we can take. One way is for us to be to hoard our personal data, and the other way is to share it, and everyone benefits. Society benefits. The economy benefits. Singapore, say in Singapore's case, it will help us fulfill our vision as a smart nation. I understand from you in one of our earlier conversations that you are writing a paper and you're doing some research on the other situations. That means non-pandemic situations where personal data has been used for public interest, right? So maybe could you share a little bit about your findings, your thoughts on that? I think you mentioned, for example, in the case of anti-terrorism, public security, etc. How do the government embark on collecting personal data? Are there any specific concerns or glitches, and how did they overcome them?
Okay, so some of the things that maybe we can conceive of going forward. I talked a little bit about these digital handshaking applications, and what I'm thinking about are situations where we are going to be matching people with each other in the online space. So something like ride sharing or delivery sharing platforms. Grab Hitch is an example or something like that, where people can be pulled together and combined together to get mutual benefit from shared services. We can also think about the sharing of time, i.e. volunteering, and matching volunteers with beneficiaries. Indeed, very much everything to do with the sharing economy. And I think, Carol, you've done quite a bit of work in this regard. Other applications might include the secure signing of contracts, receipts of digital documentation, and something that's close to my heart, calls for help and care by the disabled or the elderly, right? People can wrap themselves up in their silos and wrap themselves up in ever increasingly higher walls behind which they protect their data and their privacy. But then, in time to come, when they actually need help, when they become infirm or disabled or get old and need help, they're unable to be recognized because they've walled themselves up. Community can't help them, right? So I think if we can think about all of these different situations when we cannot just act as individuals, but can relate to the society in a very safe and secure way, I think that's the path that we definitely need to take.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Dr. Sonn, Yi-Ling, any comments?
I was thinking about what Christopher was talking about, a new way to look at data. And we've been hearing these very trite phrases: data is a new oil, data is a new sort of like a resource. And my thought there was oil finishes at some point. So does maybe like a precious metal like gold. Or these are exhaustible resources, and our information is not exhaustible, and our data can be spun in so many ways to create value, to be mined. They even used to do data mining, right? They use that term, and actually this is a resource that we'll never run out of. So I really agree with Christopher that this is, do we start looking, and I know Lawrence Lessig has said this, now do we start looking at data as property? And I've written a little bit about it in some commentaries. Because it seems to be something that's so, the market sees it as a valuable thing to be monetized. How are we benefiting from it, from the market's exploitation, collection and exploitation? And spinning and respinning of our data. How are we seeing that back in society? Because we are the sources of it. So data has value. And because we are digital now, I think we have to sort of like adjust that mindset to say that, yeah, my data is valuable. My data needs to be protected. I need more control. And if anyone wants to sort of use it, whether government or corporation, I need to understand why. This is the informed consent thing. I think no one has, I think we haven't even used that word consent yet in this discussion. And what is informed consent and how much information do I need? But I think it's a starting point to think, and I think it's important that we need to look at data differently.
Yeah, I mean, both you and Chris emphasizes a lot on human agency, right? People needing to have a different perspective, perhaps even undergo a paradigm shift with regards to how they think about their personal data. So I link it to a comment or question by Ms. Eliza Goh, and we just wondering if communications, say by the authorities, have a role in helping people have a greater clarity, in deciding, in thinking about the use of their personal data. So Ms. Goh said that communications about the public use of private data is very important to increase people's willingness to take part in data collection and data sharing initiatives. How well do you think that Singapore has done in this respect? I mean, I would like, feel free to jump in, Chris and Yi-Ling, and also Dr. Sonn. I mean, you mentioned that in South Korea, there seemed to be little resistance, quite almost like a willing embrace, because the South Koreans have seen what's happening in China, and implicitly they understand the need to cooperate with government's collection of their personal data. But are there any lessons, I mean, that we can learn from the South Korean case on how the measures and the needs are communicated to the public? So I will start with Chris and Yi-Ling, and then we hear from Dr. Sonn.
So I think I'll go back to what I said earlier. That I think that there's this asymmetry in our relationship with our data and the use of our data by the government or big tech companies. And I think what we need to do is just take back control. We can't just wait for the government to set those terms for us. And in fact, in Singapore, the government is also quite wary, as you saw in the Trace Together app, putting it together, that to dictate too much in this space. So I think we need to come to some arrangement with ourselves. Really, all of us Singaporeans need to come to some arrangement whereby we say, okay, this is how much we are prepared to share with each other. This is how much we will jealously guard to our death, right? So, and I think, I go back to my original point about, this idea of digital citizen charters. It is a way by which we can all together say, okay, easily, these are the principles by which we will guard and share data with each other, right? And it allows for opt-in, opt-out according to your individual user preferences.
Right. So one of the reasons, in addition to, South Korean case, another reason for Koreans to trust, to allow the government to get access to the data was the recent experience of MERS. I guess most of Singaporeans don't even remember what happened in 2015 because it didn't influence Singapore much. Actually, South Korea was the only one place outside the Middle East that was affected by MERS, which was a huge shock to Koreans because in South Korea, SARS was nothing. So it was completely protected. But then the MERS came in 2015 and more than 25 people died, which sounds small now when the number is compared to COVID-19, but at that time it was a huge shock. And the lesson that we got was that the secrecy doesn't work. At that time, the government the Park Geun-hye administration tried to deal with it with the tight control of the information. The government shared information with health professionals and a small number of experts, and they try not to let the information go outside the circle. And that caused a huge problem because this situation gave the hospitals economic incentive not to reveal the information that they have. Because if it is known to the public that this hospital has MERS patient, other customers wouldn't come. So all the hospitals that were treating MERS was hiding the information, and they tried to make the safety measures, security measures less visible to the public. I mean, this pandemic control is difficult when they just do everything, but when they try to make it invisible, it becomes even more difficult. So one of the main hospitals become a hotspot of infections, and that so they lost the control. So eventually, Seoul metropolitan government broke the central government's guideline and publicized all the information that they had, which eventually stopped the pandemic. So the lesson that the public, the government, and the health professional got at that time was the transparency is very important there. So in a way, South Korea is lucky on that account. And another issue was that at that time, the Park Geun-hye administration was dealing with other issues in secrecy as well. And that contributed to impeachment of Park Geun-hye as the president. So the current government, which won the election after the impeachment, had a strong incentive to deal with it differently. So it's going complete opposite. So it's going to dealing with transparency, and which is very effective in dealing with pandemic, but which also has a problem in terms of data protection. So currently, so I would say there was a bit of luck involved in the South Korean government's handling of a pandemic, because those who are likely to be very sensitive about privacy protection are the ones who elected the government, and those who are against the government, the conservative, are the ones who are less sensitive about this issue. So in both sides, they don't mind the government dealing with private information at the moment.
Yeah, Yi-Ling, you wanted to say something.
Yes. Responding to that question about communication, make the communication consistent. It has to be clear. It has to be targeted to the audience that it wants to reach. It has to be sincere, of course. And I'm not saying there isn't communication already. There is. And I'm kind of reminded of my past life as a practicing lawyer. When a client would come to me and they would say, my rights are being infringed, and I'm like, oh really? Oh yes. And then there's somehow there is some kind of issue, but their conception of what their rights are is a little bit incorrect or inaccurate, or it's a perception, or they have latched onto something that they think is the issue, and then it becomes important to them. And then I have to help them unravel that to say, is there a right in the first place that you are complaining there's infringement of? It is difficult for government to communicate to the public at large about things that are technical. And we can put out public consultations. The PDPA had 3 public consultations before, it kind of like, went to press and went into force. And people will take what they will from what you tell them. And something that kind of disturbed me a little in the last 2 or 3 weeks when we were, I think, at the beginning of the whole wave of infections with the migrant workers, was a headline, like the title of an article, and I forget which local news platform now. Technology in robotics being showcased, to combat COVID-19, and I'm like, why are you using the word showcased? This is not a time for showing off. Maybe use the word deploy. So that was something I'm like, don't show off, please, just do it and say that we're doing it, we're utilizing it, and take a functional approach to it. And this is not about trumpeting our robotics or our AI ambitions. No, this is not the time to talk about our data hub ambitions. We talk a lot about visions and everything. And Christopher, I know you have alluded to that. I'm seeing that this crisis is actually catalyzing our adoption of technology, forcing us into, whether we realize it or not, into becoming more data savvy, becoming more, understanding how we behave and how we're going to interact more digitally. This is maybe the trigger we needed to really push Smart Nation, but let's not talk in vaunting terms about it now, please, because that's not reading the room. And when you want to communicate clarity, conciseness, consistency, do it often, reach as many parts of society as you can, and the transparency, as aspect is very important as well. Again, I'm not saying it's not being done, and maybe people just don't really want to know about it until they are confronted with a situation like this where they have to grapple with it. Because otherwise, if it doesn't affect me, I am not going to care about it. Yeah.
If I may just jump in also, when we talk about communication, I think it's not just greater communication, better communication that needs to be done by the government, but also by other parties. So, for example, developers of the apps. I mean, they're not always right. They are not always public sector developers. Correct. In certain states in the US right now, we're seeing private developers, and of course, there's your Apple and there's your Google. Right. So, I think in terms of clarity, in terms of transparency, developers also need to provide more explicit guidelines and perhaps even best practice recommendations for things like how do you secure back-end systems and how long would the data be kept. Even when we download our apps from the App Store, perhaps there should be more explicit App Store policies on what additional information would be collected, right, when you download the app, for example, your GPS. Now, we are running a little bit out of time, so I want to go to two main things here, two final topics here. One is the big elephant, right, in the room, about making trace together mandatory. All right. So currently, I think it's only India adoption of their Trace Together app. Okay. So in Singapore, what do you think are the possibilities of the government mandating the downloading of the app and the use of the app, and do we anticipate any backlash, and how might we, want to circumvent that? Chris or Yi-Ling? And then after that, I'll move to the last bit on the unexpected negative consequences of sharing personal data. Anyone?
Mandatory is not palatable, I think. The government, I think I said this in my opening remarks, the government can do this, but that would be sending the wrong message, I think. If things got to such an extreme situation, they may well do it. I was just checking on the MIT technology review, and there was that they're doing a survey of countries. It's China, India, as you mentioned, and Turkey, mandatory. And I think there are about 35 places in the world right now which are grappling with this issue. The last count, like 1 hour before we got on, I was like, okay, just look at who's using what, where, and who is mandatory and all that. I'm guessing it may only come to it being made mandatory if it really gets out of hand. If it really gets out of hand. That's my point of view. Otherwise, you just fine. If you don't download it, you just can't get into NTUC to buy your toilet paper.
Chris, any comments?
I differ a little bit from Yi-Ling. I think given the speed of things happening, I think what we do need is a law, and for the government to make it mandatory. Just as the same situation as with the face masks, using face masks in public. There were some of us that took on it very quickly, but others had to be pulled into this use of or wearing a public face mask in public. And the fines had to be imposed, or even locking people up. So I think we do need the law to act in this emergency situation. And I think in the main, most Singaporeans, as I said in my opening remarks, will accept this, right? They will, however reluctantly, accept this situation. I'm more concerned about the impact that it has on the long-term relationship between us and the government. I think once they do this and impose that law upon us mandatorily, then that worry about that slippery slope comes on every single time we are approached by the government again to share more data, right? So I think it sets a precedent, and unfortunately it's not a nice precedent. So that's the trade-off. I think in an emergency situation, we've got to do it. You can only change mindsets. You can change the habits of a lifetime only with the stick of the law, right? Unfortunately.
Can I ask you a question? Because I'm not knowing
Yes,
very well about this, the tracing together app. Is it proven effective in other countries? Because South Korea is not using it, and the pandemic is controlled with access to other types of data. So I wonder if it is actually necessary to make everybody download the app before we discuss whether it is desirable.
I think it's a stress test. It needs a certain population to triangulate off before you can see whether because we move in Brownian motion. We need that Brownian motion to actually sort of bounce off each other to see if it works. And right now, what is the take up? It's kind of like 25% of the population, right? Yeah.
25.
Yeah, we need what, 75%? Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the thing. So we are very much in beta, and we only know if it's effective if we get to those numbers and start moving around. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
Iceland is saying, hey, we're using a version of your app, not effective, and like I said, we didn't make any claims that this is a silver bullet. This is only supplementing manual tracing. So
I'll come to the last topic. I mean, we have talked about, Chris, you mentioned the benefits, right? I think we all know that there are key benefits to sharing of personal data during pandemic, and you've made the case for why it's important to do it during non-pandemic times. But I think there are two possible associated problems. One of which is the exclusion of certain vulnerable segments. So for example, we have a question from Ms. Jo Lee, who asked, in the South Korea case, how about vulnerable groups such as the elderly population, people with disability, and those without tech devices when we implement such policies, right? Similarly, a recent survey that was done by the University of Maryland and the Washington Post highlighted very, very low interest among members of the public. And I think the survey also highlighted potential exclusion of vulnerable segments who are not digitally connected, such as seniors. So this is one issue, possible exclusion of certain pockets of the segment. The other real problem we are seeing right now in South Korea, and recently reported in the case of China, where personal information has actually led to the cyberbullying, cyber harassment, and doxing of individuals, right? So what would some of your comments be? Quick, brief comments, and then we'll wrap up. Dr.
Right,
Sonn, would you like to start?
Right. I mean, in terms of the exclusion from the use of technology, I think that is a less of a concern at the moment because, firstly, so there isn't much that users have to do for the use of government use of the data, because it's what people are confused is that location of a mobile phone is always recorded, whether there is a GPS function in the phone or not. So even if you are using 2G mobile phone, like from 15 years ago, mobile network providers still have record of the locations, because mobile phone has to be connected to one of the mobile towers. So the location of the mobile tower is obviously the mobile phone network provider knows where the network tower is. So they always have know the location information of every phone, every single phone that is turned on. So even if you are not savvy about with the smartphone, that doesn't affect the effectiveness of government use of data. And there are a small minority who do not have mobile phones, but they are the kind who is less likely to be exposed to coronavirus. So that's sort of okay. And the cyberbullying, that's a serious problem, I think. And the names are not known, but people still can bully the certain patient number 61 is idiot, and that sort of remarks on the internet can hurt people. And as far as you know, you are patient number 61, and that was actually totally unnecessary. So when the government publishes information about the location of infections, they didn't have to list all the places based on the patient number. They could simply publish the locations of potential infections without connecting them to a specific people. So they can mix up several people together instead of listing visited places patient by patient. So these are the ideas. These very new ideas that was reported in media only recently. So I guess they didn't think about this when before they implementing this law. So.
Okay, Chris, Yi-Ling, any final remarks on this?
Yeah. Okay. So Singapore, we have a digital inclusion blueprint, and that sets out some of our objectives in terms of including some of these vulnerable groups. I think this pandemic, the reason why we need to accelerate the digital access for everybody, as Yi-Ling was saying, we need to do this now, right? So let's get going with that as fast as possible. It is inequality in the digital access space, and as with income inequality, we think that this is something that needs to be addressed. It affects the participation of all our members of society, and if they're not included, they're not part of our citizenry. So we need to act on this really quickly, I think. But in Singapore, we're blessed; we have the resources to do this.
I think this whole crisis, is on a daily basis is revealing to us, and I don't have to go into the details. Everybody who follows the news, we are seeing where the gaps are in society. We are seeing where the vulnerable are. We are seeing where the disenfranchised are. We are seeing the homeless, the rough sleepers. We are seeing those with mental health conditions. We are seeing people who just they're crawling up the walls. They are all cabin fever reacting to this. We are seeing all our flaws, and some of them are quite tremendous. And Christopher, it was something that you said earlier on today. I said maybe we need to. This is a tabula rasa. This is a tabula rasa moment. Clean slate. How do we want to exist as a people? How do we want to exist as a society? Where do we see ourselves post this? Because this is a great opportunity. And it's weird that I'm having to put a positive spin on this, but it's a great opportunity for people to take a very hard look at how we have existed and how the things we have taken for granted. And now we are seeing how connected we are. We are seeing how connected we are, and we're seeing how vulnerable we are, and we're seeing, yes, maybe we have to, I agree with you, just look at our data, and look at how we use it and how we can, exploit it ourselves. To kind of maybe fix these long-standing issues in society. Yeah, that's all I have.
Okay. Great. Thank you for ending us on a positive note. I mean, this has been a great discussion. I think we have covered quite a fair bit of ground, but unfortunately, we've come to the end of the forum. Now, the informal poll that you participated in earlier is still live. Now that you've joined us in the forum, we would like to hear from you on how you feel about the topic. So do share your thoughts with poll. Now, the link to the informal poll is posted in the comment section. So please allow me, to thank you, the panelists, as well as to all of you who have joined us at IPS Online. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.